English translation, 487th contact. Wednesday, 3rd February 2010, 14 and 11 hours.
There you are. Greetings and welcome. Just got back 3 minutes ago from Schmidrudi, where we regularly have our half-hour coffee break on Wednesday.
Greetings, dear friend. Yes, I know about your coffee time.
Good. Can I ask you about the result of the English translations right now? Have you now gone through everything again? And do you stick to what you said in the end, that we should not do any more translations?
We have actually made an effort. In the process, we, who are a committee for your affairs, have come to the conclusion that we should meet with our linguists to discuss everything with them and seek their advice. In doing so, we have examined all the translations made so far from the Goblet of the Truth into English, as well as all other works, great and small, translated into English and other earthly languages. Unfortunately, the whole thing proves to be extremely inadequate, for not one of the translations made from the original German texts corresponds to them in a valuable way. In many cases, the actual original meaning is not given in the translations because the necessary accurate expressions, terms, and words do not exist in the languages concerned. Very often, not even synonyms exist, which could be used as absolutely identical meanings of words and thus be exchanged respectively replaced in a text without changing the statement or its meaning. Innumerable terms and words that are given in the German language do not exist in all other earthly languages. And furthermore, the true meaning and value of many terms and words is not recognized correctly and therefore completely misinterpreted. This happens on the one hand because the origin of the terms and words is completely unknown, or because a false origin is assumed, and this even occurs with linguists of the German language, that is to say, with Germanists, which leads to fundamentally wrong explanations and explanations of terms and words. After all the considerations, clarifications, and analyses, we have come to the unanimous decision that in future you should not carry out any more translations from your side of the Mother Center, not even into English. This is not a language in itself, but only a halfway acceptable world aid language, which has been spread worldwide by unfair machinations from the USA with the help of British English and other languages, the deeper meaning being to make the earthly peoples English-speaking with this poor means of communication. From our side, then, we recommend that you should not make any more translations once you have completed the work Goblet of the Truth, which in the English language unfortunately contains only inadequate translation values of all this, as everything is given in the German language. This despite the fact that the basic work of translation is done by a specialist of a translation company. The whole thing can only be useful and valuable for the learners and interested people if they make an effort to learn the German language in an extensive form, so that they can turn to the content of the spiritual teachings and learn everything through them. In all other earthly languages, the corresponding translations of spiritual teachings and all works related to them give only a faint reflection of their true meaning when such translations are made. And for all that I have now explained, there is a requirement that you should bring everything up at your meeting next Saturday with the necessary explanations. The understanding and reasoning of all members should be so superficial that a decisive, unanimous decision will be made within this framework.
Of course, I will present everything at the General Assembly and state your request, which I believe will be understood, and therefore a reasonable decision will also be taken. But since you speak so clearly about terms and words, as I often do, it is perhaps necessary to explain these two values, because I know that many German-speaking human beings, also Germanists, do not see any difference in them. So I would like to say that a term is, so to speak, The content of an idea, which as a whole forms an essential characteristic of a mental entity, from which a certain view, an opinion, an image, and also an understanding result, which can be expressed verbally respectively with the help of language, but also in writing. The word, on the other hand, is a small or smallest independent linguistic unit of sound, whereby the word can also be recorded in writing, but without sounding or respectively as a silent non-sounding. Thus the word is a linguistic and also a written utterance with a certain meaning, which as a small or smallest part determines the language and the written language. However, in relation to what you said, I would like to ask you whether I understand correctly that simply from our side, that is to say the core group of our mother center, no more translations are to be made, while it is to be left to the discretion of Figu groups in other languages, if they wish to translate the Figu books, etc., into their national languages.
This is the meaning of my statement, which is also based on the decision of our deliberations.
So this means that other Figu groups can translate our Figu books and writings into their national languages. This is clear, but I think that the clause is also valid that a publication may only be made together with the original German text. I think it is also necessary to declare that the core group of the Figu Mother Center does not guarantee the accuracy of the translations, and therefore also does not take responsibility for the meaning and true content of the translations. This, I think, should also be placed before every translation, as well as the statement that it is impossible to translate the original German language works into other languages in a true manner, and that therefore students and other interested parties must be encouraged to learn the German language extensively in order to understand and comprehend everything correctly, and in the true and deepest sense.
I wanted to come back to this, but you have anticipated my explanation that has to be made in this regard. So, all that remains to be said is that there is a need for all works translated by Figu groups in other languages, or by any person to be given the necessary permission in the form of a contract by you or by the core group of the Figu Mother Center.
And what about when queries come? Should we answer them in relation to translations?
I guess you have to decide that from case to case, because such queries can mean a lot of work that you would have to deal with.
So I guess it is better not to get too involved.
That is my opinion.
And what about the English speakers who have websites that also have US Figu stuff, etc.? It is probably that they should help themselves, because if they stick to the website owners or to the Figu members in the USA, it would be counterproductive, because it would further promote the crazy English language. But this is not the whole point, because it would be counterproductive against the learning and use of the German language, which is effectively the only language through which all values and the meaning of the whole can be fully expressed, the spiritual teachings and countless other things.
There is nothing to add to your statement, because it corresponds to correctness.
Good, then that is settled. May I ask, then, if you have the latest data on the earthly population yet? You once said over the last year that this clarification is an ongoing task that you have to do.
That is correct. Our last census was on the 31st of December 2009, which gave us a total number of earthly humanity of 7,831, 814, 138.
It should be said that your censuses include all human beings on Earth, therefore also the 1,000,000,000 or so who are never counted in censuses because they live in the big cities and towns on the streets and in the underground in cities with millions of inhabitants, but also in the wilderness and in jungles as indigenous people, etc. This is also not taken into account in official censuses because they are not registered. This is not taken into account in the censuses, nor is the fact that even in official censuses, not all human beings are recorded in the relevant official areas because they are not registered.
This is true, so no further explanation is necessary. But what I want to say now is this. Your new work, God Delusion, has already created a number of new enemies against you because information about the book has penetrated religious and sectarian circles.
I knew from the beginning that this was going to happen. But the whole thing does not bother me. On the contrary, I am glad that I have received words of thanks from many reasonable human beings for the book, that finally a work has been written and published, in which no one minces his words when the facts are mentioned, as is done despondently by others who deal with the same subject in their books and writings, but who cowardly do not dare to speak openly.
This is well known to me. But you must be aware that under certain circumstances, new attacks against your life may be made again. On earth, it has always been the case that true prophets are unwelcome, through whom it is shown what is right and what is wrong. In general, it has always been the case, and also in the present time, that every human being who makes a serious effort to bring good, valuable, clear laws and behaviors, a correct order as well as true love, freedom, harmony, humanity, and true peace into the world and thus among earthly humanity, is slandered, persecuted, and tried to be murdered. Every human being who works for a better world and for all the above-mentioned humane values makes many enemies among the believers and representatives of religions and sects, but also among terrorists, rulers, and other politicians. But enemies also arise among the military, scientists, and certain inventors, because all of them have a lot to lose.
Especially the Pope and the Dalai Lama belong to that. And I have a bulletin question to answer directly in regard to the Dalai Lama, because people simply do not want to understand what is really going on with this bloke, and that he is not the peaceful human being which he always pretends, worldwide, to be. Truly, he is certainly not a holiness, that is to say, a venerable one. Rather, he is a feigned holiness. The reader's question which I shall answer is, why do you abusively insult the Dalai Lama, who is really a peace-loving and good human being? That which you write about him in your bulletins is unbelievable. A. Sanders, Germany.
Lies, bigotry, and slander hold very much more weight for the Earth humans than does the truth.
An article has also appeared in which something is said about that which is really behind the Dalai Lama. So, the talk therein is also that the truth about him is this. He pretends to be a worldwide apostle of peace and is followed by millions of faithful, who transfer millions in funds to him with which he can carry out and finance his secret work in Tibet. Millions, from which the misogynist can also live very well, whereby it is primarily the woman, of all people, who believe in him, who finance him as thanks, as it were, that he is ill-disposed towards them, but because of his faked pious and peace-loving nature, they do not realize it. But his image as an apostle of peace does not correspond to the truth, just as his holiness is also only the mask of his sanctimoniousness. Born Tenzin Gyatso, he was appointed as a child to the position of 14th Dalai Lama, respectively, to the position of the highest ecclesiastical dignitary and political head of Lamaism. Enthroned from 1935 until 1940, he fled to India after China occupied Tibet in 1959, and ended the bloody goings-on and the serfdom maintained by the Dalai Lama, and the punishments of blinding, flogging, hacking off of limbs and appropriation of the property of Tibetans who had committed punishable offenses. He set up his Indian residence in Dharamsala in the state of Himachal Pradesh. Since the advent of the Tibetan government in exile, he has been the leader whereby, however, this government in exile is not officially acknowledged by any country. Nevertheless, however, many powerful state figures of diverse countries crawl up the Dalai Lama's backside and help him. Officially, the government in exile supports negotiations with the Chinese government in order to obtain real autonomy for Tibet. At the international level, the Dalai Lama sanctimoniously devotes himself to love, peace, freedom, and tolerance among the religions and peoples, as well as to the observation of humanity's global responsibility. For that reason, he was also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. Thereby, however, the fact was completely disregarded, probably due to ignorance, that, behind his actions and his sanctimonious behavior, he strives for religious and political might and leads a Tibetan resistance movement. This positions itself against the brutal force of the Chinese and has caused great harm since it has been in existence. The members of this underground army call themselves freedom fighters, whereby, however, in reality, they commit terrorist acts against the Chinese occupiers. The weapons they employ are extremely varied and range from slingshots, knives, pistols and rifles, and swords, right up to captured Chinese artillery. Therewith, and by means of their underhandedness, their hate and their thirst for blood and revenge, which they call fearlessness, they taught the Chinese occupiers angst. But they also taught them to raise themselves up, more brutally than ever, against the Tibetans. And all that leads back to the so peaceful and love-preaching Dalai Lama. Truly there is nothing pertaining to the freedom fighters, secretly led by the Dalai Lama, which would position them passively against the Chinese occupation, because peace readiness is, for them, just as much a sanctimonious farce, and indeed, exactly to the degree maintained by their leader. Yet the simple Tibetans, as well as the exiled Tibetans and the worldwide believers and followers of the Dalai Lama, know nothing of all that. However, the Chinese Tibetan occupation, for which the whole thing is a military nightmare, knows better. And one can understand this well when one knows that the Tibetan underground army, Chushi Gungdruk, still exists today and carries out its murderous mischief against the Chinese occupation. This underground army, led by Gyalo Thondup, a brother of the Dalai Lama, was, namely, never disbanded. Earlier, they were supported by the US-American CIA and indeed for around 25 years. When this was the case, the Dalai Lama also managed to obtain the USA's support for himself and the exiled Tibetan court against China. Thereby, with this Dalai Lama-USA connection, armed conflicts were also fought out with the Chinese occupiers by means of USA powers and Tibetan Chushi Gangdruk fighters, whereby it was said of the Tibetan peace fighters that over a long period of time, for every Tibetan killed, 10 Chinese had been killed. The Dalai Lama's flight was already prepared in 1951, and indeed with the help of the US-American Secret Service's CIA, whereby, at the same time, with their help, great treasures were also already secretly smuggled to India out of the Dalai Lama's main city, Lhasa, primarily gold dust and silver bullion with a current value of around 65 million Swiss francs, respectively, about 47.5 million euros. Then, years later, the Dalai Lama's flight took place, well organized by the CIA, which had earlier, in the USA, already trained a small elite army of freedom fighters, and indeed in Camp Hale in the Rocky Mountains, which then also accompanied and protected the Dalai Lama as he fled. It comprised around 350 soldiers and 50 freedom fighters. But that was not enough, because the elite fighters had still other tasks to carry out, as, for example, the guerrilla war, but also in that they, as paratroopers, jumped out of smuggled B-17 bombers, which bore no national emblems, and led a terrorist form of war against the brutal Chinese occupiers. And so that they could not talk, they were equipped with very fast-acting cyanide poison capsules, which they were required to swallow in the event of being taken prisoner. Yet that was still not enough, because the CIA also pottered about outside of Tibet, as, for example, in the Kingdom of Mustang in Nepal, where a rebel army of more than 12,000 terrorist fighters was set up, which carried out murderous actions against the Chinese occupation in Nepal. And the fact that all the CIA machinations, in association with Tibet, has cost the USA hundreds of millions of dollars, is naturally clear, yet even today that is not known by the American people. Also, that the Dalai Lama was paid $186,000 US annually would not be known by the American people. Only in 1972 was the CIA's direct support for the Tibetan resistance suspended. Only, however, to be continued by a private, although federally organized, financing, as well as by means of the help of ignorant Dalai Lama followers. One can name, for example, the National Endowment for Democracy, which spent, and still spends, millions of US dollars in order to damage China and to claim that China steers the bloody unrest in Tibet. The NED claims this contrary to better knowledge, and, self-evidently, contrary to its denial of all its activities in regard to that. And what the CIA carried out earlier in Tibet is carried out these days in secret by His Feigned Holiness, the Dalai Lama.
You have portrayed the matters correctly, and I think that you can also use that which you have said as an answer for the bulletin question.
Good idea. Then I already have one less piece of work. But tell me, is the swine flu finished now, or will it continue to exist?
For now, the epidemic is thoroughly over, yet it can always emerge again in the time to come. Whereby it must be understood, however, that in regard to its dangerousness, it is no worse than any other, and, under certain circumstances, no worse than more dangerous influenza epidemics. But the next epidemic already waits in the wings because, in the Benelux countries, a new epidemic spreads, which has already demanded 1,236 victims. But this fact, however, is partly kept silent, but not in order to avoid imprudence, but rather because a certain profiteering calculation is behind it. That was also the case with swine flu, in association with which, however, silence was not maintained. But instead, angst and terror were intentionally spread, whereby the pharmaceutical companies earned many millions of US dollars, Swiss francs, and euros with antiviral vaccines and medications. The new epidemic concerns so-called goat flu, which also corresponds to an epidemic and is also passed on to human beings, of which already far more than 1,000 have succumbed, whereby there are also some fatalities. Yet this epidemic is also no worse than any other.
I can imagine that the responsible authorities hold their tongues more and keep quieter this time in order to perhaps, yet again, rake in billions. Often very strange paths are taken in order to make horrendous financial profit. But tell me, what do you think about the fact that in Liechtenstein as well as in Switzerland account data are stolen by criminal bank employees, which Germany has already bought up and is again buying up and wants to use them against tax evaders? France has also been offered such data. In my opinion, no states should buy such stolen data or also not receive it free of charge and use it against tax evaders. Because both by paying and by receiving such data as a gift, the buyers or recipients of the stolen data are making themselves liable to prosecution. This does not even require the laws of a state under the rule of law. Because if something is stolen and sold or given as a gift, not only the thieves make themselves liable to prosecution, but also the buyers or the recipients of gifts. Theft of any kind of goods is just as punishable as buying or accepting them as gifts. This is stated in all criminal laws and may not be changed, also not by the government of any state changing or bending the laws to circumvent the laws and to gain public or private benefit from it. Theft and receiving stolen goods also remain theft and receiving without laws. This is my opinion.
Your opinion does not need to be corrected, because theft remains the same as theft. Just as the purchase or receipt of stolen goods corresponds to criminal receiving of stolen goods, regardless of whether something is done in this way in a private or state manner. So if the data you have mentioned is bought or given as a gift and used by the German or French government, then those responsible make themselves liable to prosecution and must be brought before the courts for punishment and also removed from office. The persons who have stolen the account data in the banks must also face criminal prosecution by the courts.
And if it is not handled that way, then all the legislation and the rule of law is no good.
I can only agree with you there.
If the rulers act against the law, they should be tried and punished like any other citizen who breaks the law in any way. If this is not done in such a way, then the big crooks will be rewarded for their breaking of the law, but the small scoundrels will be hung by the nearest branch or otherwise maliciously punished.
Unfortunately, this very often corresponds to earthly practices.
Here I have another bulletin question for which I have written the following as an answer, and indeed in accord with your earlier explanations, which I have, in the meantime, also had confirmed by a newspaper article. If you will please listen.
Question. Did Rasputin really lead a dissolute life as it is portrayed these days? We are convinced that it was not so. Yeberchi, Switzerland.
Answer. Rasputin did not lead a dissolute life as is attributed to him. This story is malicious slander. However, it is true that his murder could barely have been surpassed in terms of its brutality when in 1916 he was murdered with a .455 Webley pistol by a British agent by the name of Oswald Rayner. Although he was married and had a family, Rasputin was an itinerant monk, that is to say, an itinerant preacher, who, through suggestive influence, carried out miraculous healings which were truly self-healings of the sick. Thereby he also reached the court of the Tsars, where he had much influence as a friend to the Tsar's family, especially because, through a miracle healing, he had saved the Tsar's son from death. That did not please many sectors of the Russian nobility, for which reason they became Rasputin's sworn enemies, sought to take his life, and named him Holy Devil. On the 17th of December 1916, he was then actually also kidnapped and murdered, whereby his murderer was, however, the aforementioned British agent who acted in the commission of the nobles and England. The reason for the murder was Rasputin's political objectives, which endangered the victory of Great Britain in the First World War, which raged at that time. But the murder of Rasputin still had other reasons, because through the nefarious deed, the already long-planned Russian Revolution could also gain ground and be carried out, and the Tsar's family could be captured and murdered. Rasputin was the most important advisor to the court of the Russian Tsar's family. As already explained, he was kidnapped on the 17th of December 1916, whereby the main role was played by a conspirator by the name of Felix Yusupov, who had a friendly relationship with the British agent Oswald Rayner. Rasputin was dragged into a palace cellar in St. Petersburg, where he was tortured and also poisoned, whereby he was, however, able to counteract the poison, and therefore it did not have the desired effect, and he survived the poison attack and was able to flee. But he did not get far because a revolver was taken, and he was shot 2 times in the back from behind, which he, however, also survived. So the murderer took his weapon again and shot Rasputin in the forehead. Rasputin then died immediately. Therefore, he was first seriously injured by the British agent Oswald Rayner with several shots which, however, Rasputin survived because he simply did not want to die. Only the shot in the forehead really killed him. Consequently, therefore, in this way, a professional execution ultimately occurred. After that, the giant of a man was bound up by the noble conspirators and dragged to the icy Neva River, where they threw him in the icy water. Naturally, the assassins were quickly found, yet the Tsar stopped the police investigation. The conspirators asserted that they had murdered Rasputin because he had exercised too great an influence on the family of the Tsar. These statements from the assassins were, however, not the actual reason why the Tsar did not intervene in the matter of the murder and its investigation. Rather, it was the fact that it was not a Russian, but a foreigner, the British agent, Oswald Rayner to be exact, who was Rasputin's real murderer. The true reason for the murder was that Rasputin, peace-loving as he was active in pressing for an armistice, in order to thereby end the state of war between Russia and Germany, and in order, additionally, to also avoid a defeat. And his chances of implementing his desire were, in this regard, very good, because the Tsar, due to Rasputin's enormous influence on the Tsar's family, was willing to bend to Rasputin's wishes and to declare an armistice. But the British, who saw their plans and the victory in the First World War endangered by Rasputin's peaceful political aims, did not like that. Consequently, they introduced into the plan as murderer an agent who worked hand in hand with the conspirators and whose murder plan fitted theirs exactly, because the nobility were also not keen on an armistice. Had this come about then, the entire history of the world would have changed. Because, namely, an end to the war with Russia would have enabled Germany to transfer an army of 350,000 soldiers to the Western Front. It would have thereby been possible for the German Kaiser to position his armies against the armies of France, Great Britain, and the USA, and to overcome them, and to be victorious. So, Rasputin's murderer, with his license to kill, committed a cold-blooded murder in the commission of the British Crown, so that in the First World War the Allies could obtain victory over the German Empire.
Now, my question in regard to that is the whole thing that I have written here completely right, or is there still something else to mention?
There is nothing to add to that which you have read out, because it should suffice and it is also right. There is no need to introduce more explanations about the matter, because that which occurred happened around 94 years ago and is no longer relevant. It is not sensible to poke around in old things.
I guess you are right. But there is an interest among Earthlings in old things, and that is why they are poking around.
But the whole thing is not really useful, except for the fact that a knowledge is created which has happened in the past. In this way, the research is to be understood in relation to old things, but not to make something sensational out of them. But now, dear Edward, my friend, I would like to talk to you elsewhere in a private way if you have nothing more to ask.
I have not, no.